Welcome back to Calm Coding, the podcast to keep you in the loop on all things cybersecurity. Ready to dive deep into some recent attacks and vulnerabilities?
Always. Things are getting pretty spicy out there.
You can say that again. We've got ransomware groups, nation-state actors, even schools and water facilities facing some pretty new threats.
Yeah, cybersecurity isn't just for the big guys anymore. It's something everyone, especially developers, needs to be thinking about these days.
For sure. So let's start with those making headlines, the ransomware gangs.
Yeah.
The Cleo group, the ones from the movie It Attacks. Well, they're back and exploiting Cleo MFT products now.
Oh, wow.
And get this, they're saying they'll delete any data they swipe from the government or healthcare.
Interesting. I bet that's strategic. Those sectors have the most heat from law enforcement, so by avoiding them, they can lay low while still hitting plenty of businesses.
Trying to minimize the risk, huh? Maximize that profit. Disturbing, but I guess it shows they know law enforcement is on their tail.
Exactly. It's that old cat and mouse game. And while groups like Cleo are switching things up, nation-state actors are upping their game too, like, for example, Midnight Blizzard.
They're the ones linked to Russia, right? Going after governments and militaries in the West.
Yep. But it's not just them. They've been targeting academic researchers too.
Researchers. Why them?
Well, think about what kind of information universities have. Cutting-edge research, tech, engineering, even political data. That's a gold mine for foreign intelligence agencies trying to, get ahead.
Real-life spy stuff happening online. And they're not exactly using simple methods either. Almost 200 RDP proxies to cover their tracks.
Yeah.
Like a super complex VPN to hide their location, right?
Exactly. That level of sophistication shows you how determined and well-resourced these actors are. This isn't just about stealing data. It's about global power plays.
And on the other side, you've got all these new targets who might not have the defenses to match.
Yeah, and that brings us to something pretty scary: schools. More and more schools are vulnerable. There was a study recently that found a crazy number of UK schools, both primary and secondary, had security breaches last year.
Wow. And what's worse is that a ton of parents feel good about their kids' school's cybersecurity, but hardly any schools require security training.
Right. It's a recipe for disaster. Schools have so much sensitive data, student info especially, and that stuff is worth a fortune on the dark web. But they're seen as easy targets. They just don't have the resources like bigger organizations.
And it's not just schools either. CISA and the EPA even put out a warning to water facilities in the U.S., urging them to beef up security. Apparently, pro-Russian hacktivists have already shown they can disrupt water treatment, messing with pumps, disabling alarms, even changing passwords.
That's unsettling. Imagine if someone messed with a whole city's water. It really makes you realize how vulnerable we all are in this digital age.
So with all these threats out there, what's being done to protect us?
Well, the U.S. government is trying to be more proactive. CISA issued its first binding operational directive of 2025, BOD 25001. It's all about securing Microsoft 365 environments.
So federal agencies will have to meet certain standards now.
Exactly. They'll need to use assessment tools to find security gaps, put stricter policies in place, and stick to secure configuration baselines. It's a good sign that the government is finally taking this seriously.
Hopefully everyone else will follow their lead.
Let's hope so. Leading by example is so important, especially as these threats get more and more advanced.
And speaking of advanced threats, there's something that caught my eye. Researchers have found a campaign that's targeting developers specifically. The ones working on, Web3 and cryptocurrency.
Oh yeah, I read about that. Malicious extensions on the VSCode marketplace. Sneaky little packages designed to download hidden payloads.
And they were really good at hiding it too. Official-looking GitHub repos, good reviews, the whole 9 yards. A classic supply chain attack. Attack the tools developers use every day.
Exactly. And when they compromise a trusted source like that, they can spread malware to tons of people without raising any alarms. It shows how important it is to be super careful about what you download, even from places that look legit.
And it's not just about downloads. It's about the dependencies we use in our projects. Remember that huge WordPress hack a while back? Turned out it was a malicious package on NPM. It was fine at first, but then got updated with malware.
Yikes. It's scary how these supply chain attacks work. You could be using something perfectly safe one day, and the next it's been weaponized against you.
So even if you've checked something before, you can't just assume it'll stay safe. Got to be careful and keep those dependencies updated.
Absolutely. And think about using a package manager that lets you lock down those dependency versions. Just another layer of protection.
So we've covered a lot. Ransomware, nation states, even vulnerabilities targeting developers. The cybersecurity world is constantly changing.
And that's why staying informed is so important. You got to keep up with the latest threats and best practices. That's your first line of defense.
Knowledge is power, right? But it can feel overwhelming sometimes. Where should developers even start with all this?
Well, before we get into the specifics, it's important to understand the idea of zero trust.
Zero trust. Sounds kind of intense.
It might, but it's really just a mindset. You assume that no user or system is automatically trustworthy. Every single access request has to be checked, no matter where it's coming from.
So no assumptions, verify everything.
Exactly. It's about constantly verifying and making sure that if a breach does happen, the damage is limited.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do you actually put that into practice?
Well, that's a whole other deep dive.
Okay, I'm already interested. But let's move on for now and see how this zero trust thing works in the real world.
Sounds good. But first, let's talk about some specific threats and vulnerabilities developers need to watch out for. We'll get into the details of a pretty serious flaw in Apache Struts and some scary new malware that's going after our personal devices. Let's get into this vulnerability that's got the Java world kind of buzzing. It's a critical flaw in Apache Struts.
Apache Struts. Rings a bell. Remind me what it is again.
Sure. It's a framework a lot of people use for building those Java web applications. And this vulnerability, it's tracked as CVE 2024-53677, is a pretty big deal. Attackers can use it to run whatever code they want remotely, basically taking over the whole server.
So anyone using an old version of Struts could have their apps hijacked. Sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, it's not good. And what's worse is that there's already a proof of concept exploit out in the open. That means attackers are already trying to use this thing to break into systems.
Time is ticking then. What can people do to protect themselves?
First things first, they gotta patch their systems. Apache has released updates that fix the problem, so upgrading is key.
And what if they can't patch right away? You know, maybe they've got old systems or it's just too complicated to patch immediately. What can they do?
There are some workarounds. They can try to reduce the risk in the short term, but patching is the ultimate solution. It's like slapping a bandage on a wound, you know? It might help for a bit, but it won't fix the actual problem.
It really shows how important it is to have a good vulnerability management plan. Companies need to be able to spot these things quickly, assess them, and fix them before the bad guys can exploit them.
Absolutely. You can't just react to threats. You have to be proactive.
And speaking of proactive, let's switch gears a bit and talk about something that affects all of us, our webcams and DVRs. There's this new malware going around called HiatusRAT, and it's targeting these devices specifically.
This one's really sneaky. It gives the attacker total control over the device, turning it into their own personal spy cam. They can turn on your webcam, record audio, steal your data, and you wouldn't even know.
So we could be broadcasting our lives to hackers without even knowing it.
Creepy. And what's worse is that the FBI is saying these HiatusRAT attackers are going after Chinese-branded webcams and DVRs that Western companies and government agencies use.
Sounds like a classic espionage campaign. Really shows you need to secure all your devices, not just your computer. It's easy to forget about those simpler devices. So what can people do to protect themselves from this HiatusRAT and other similar threats?
Well, keep those devices updated. A lot of these attacks exploit known vulnerabilities, so patching is huge. Use strong, unique passwords for everything. And if you can, unplug devices when you're not using them. Oh, and maybe consider covering your webcam when you're not using it.
Simple but effective.
Okay.
So let's go back to what the government's doing. We talked about CISA's new directive, BOD 2501, the one for Microsoft 365. It's meant for federal agencies, but is there anything in there for businesses and everyday people who use Microsoft 365?
Definitely. That directive has some best practices that everyone can use. For example, they really push using assessment tools to find those security misconfigurations. Think of it like a checkup for your Microsoft 365 environment. Helps you find those weak spots before someone else does.
So stay ahead of the game. Don't wait till something bad happens.
Exactly. They also make it mandatory to have security policies and those secure configuration baselines. It's about having clear rules to keep everything secure across your organization.
Sounds like a big step towards that zero trust model we talked about. You assume breaches will happen, and you have safeguards in place.
Yeah, spot on. The stuff in that directive really fits well with the whole zero trust philosophy.
Before we finish up, I wanted to touch on something that's often overlooked: backups. I was reading that those traditional backup strategies might not be enough anymore, especially with ransomware attacks getting more advanced.
You're right, that's a huge point. Those ransomware groups aren't just encrypting your data anymore, they're going after your backups too. So just having a backup isn't a guarantee you'll be able to recover.
So what do you do? How do you make sure your backups are safe, even if the main system is compromised?
The key is something called immutable storage. In this kind of system, once the data is stored, it can't be changed or deleted, not even by administrators, like a super secure digital vault that can't be tampered with.
So even if those attackers got into the backup system, they couldn't do anything to the data.
Exactly. It's becoming a must-have for any ransomware defense plan. And it's good to see that more and more businesses are realizing this. That article I mentioned said a huge number of IT professionals are planning to invest in immutable storage.
Good to hear. Shows that companies are taking these evolving threats seriously and changing their approach.
Definitely a positive sign, but the reality is that cybersecurity is a never-ending race. We have to constantly adapt and learn to stay one step ahead.
A lifelong journey, but an important one, especially for us developers. We've got a responsibility to build secure software and make the digital world a safer place.
Totally agree. And that brings us to the human side of cybersecurity. Even with all the fancy tech, so many attacks still rely on tricking people.
Social engineering, right?
Okay.
Phishing emails, bad links, scams to get people to give away their passwords.
Exactly. And here's where we as developers can really make a difference. We need to design systems that are harder to trick, systems that are secure from the start, and don't rely on users always making the right choices.
So bake security into the foundation of the software, not just add it on later.
You got it. And it requires a change in how we think about security, both for developers and companies. We need to make security a priority right from the beginning and make it part of every stage of development.
I'm totally with you there. It's about creating a culture of security awareness and responsibility that's part of everything we do in software development.
Exactly. And as we head into 2025 and beyond, that focus on building secure software is only going to get more and more important.
So how can we as developers actually build software that's less vulnerable to those human mistakes? What are some practical steps we can take?
One thing is to try and limit how much users have to think about security. For example, instead of making them create strong passwords, this system could just generate and manage passwords for them.
Makes sense. Take the guesswork out. What about other ways to design out those vulnerabilities that exploit human behavior?
Oh, absolutely. We can make interfaces that are harder to fall for phishing attacks, like really clearly showing who an email is from or warning someone before they click a suspicious link.
It's like building in safety measures, like railings on stairs or those warning labels. You can't always stop people from making mistakes, but you can make those mistakes less likely.
Yeah, good analogy. And we can't forget about education. We need to teach users about those security threats and best practices, building prompts and tutorials to help them make safer choices.
Empower them with knowledge, give them the tools to make those good decisions.
Right. And remember, security is ongoing. You can't just do it once and forget about it. You have to constantly check your systems, find those weak spots, and adapt.
Eternal vigilance, right?
Yeah.
The price of security in the digital age.
Yeah.
And as developers, we're the ones on the front lines.
True. It's a challenging landscape, but it's also really exciting to be in a field where we can really make a difference.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, everyone, if you want to learn more about anything we've talked about today, check out the show notes for all those links and resources.
Stay safe and keep coding.
And keep coding calmly.